guidance. So for all our friends joining us in Lusophone, Francophone, or Anglophone, you'll be able to consume this content. We should also say thank you very much to all our supporting colleagues from different regions who, even after this interruption, will be able to make news and coverage and discussions and learning points because all the content that is being shared here will reach out to everyone. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the launch of the 2023 Africa Tobacco Industry Interference Index. My name is Master Chimbala. Be your host for the entire session of our event today. Dear friends, none of us ever in the world would celebrate or be pleased with the fact that tobacco causes 8 million people to die every year all over the world. Not even the tobacco industry, at least one would wish, I think. And unfortunately, the tobacco industry strives so very hard to ensure that the continued consumption, especially escalating with greater numbers, is being profoundly fostered every day so that more people cause more profits to their side, regardless of the terrible harm it causes on humanity and obviously on nature. As such, many governments are faced with the dilemma of the tobacco industry, which exists legally in their countries and sells legal but lethal products. This is the government's desire and obligation to protect their own citizens against these death-causing products. While the World Health Organization Framework Convention for Tobacco Control, WHO FCTC, sets the basis for strict regulation of tobacco products, parties can only truly implement the treaty if they effectively domesticate it and have the political will to implement all its requirements. And that seems to be the problem with most of the countries in the WHO Afro region. The sad reality is that many countries are yet to even adopt a law that is compliant with the WHO FCTC, despite their ratification of the convention many years ago. And most parties in the region that have struggled to adopt the tobacco control laws barely implement them. We are here today, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, to launch the 2023 Africa Tobacco Industry Interference Index, which measures the level of tobacco industry interference and how governments dealt with such interference in 18 countries of the WHO Afro region. I wish to promise all of us seated in this space of this launch webinar that there is rich content to be shared on this platform, and among them, expert analysis from different people who spent years in the space of tobacco control, but also in various ally thematic areas, drawn from different spaces within leadership, governance, policy, training, and so forth. I should also mention once again that we have interpretation services in English, French, and Portuguese, so feel free to choose your preferred language from the icon below as guided earlier with the guidance of our different language holders on the platform. This session is being recorded and will be provided to you in all 3 languages. Towards the end of today's launch, we will have a Q&A, as a question and answer session. And as we begin presentations, should you have a question, you needn't wait longer. You can already drop in your questions for any of our panelists or any thematic issue being tackled on the table in today's launch webinar. Dear friends, I wish for us to already march and start our program with the first start, which is regarding the report findings. And we'll have that from Dr. R.T. Singh. And Dr. R.T. Singh is a public health physician and a faculty member with the School of Public Health the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. He has extensive experience in tobacco control research, including smoke-free policies, illicit tobacco trade, and tobacco taxes in Ghana. Dr. Artie also led the generation of the African Regional Tobacco Industry Interference Index for 2021 and 2022. Dr. Artie, great welcome, and thanks for being part of the space in our interactions on this webinar today. I'm very, very excited. And let me already drop a key question to start up our conversation to Dr. Artie here as she gets in to share with us. In your team, you developed this, when you developed this research, just kindly share with us the key findings and recommendations that you drew up regarding this entire space of the tobacco industry interference index. Dr. Artie, over to you.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. It's a great opportunity for me to once again present to you the Tobacco Interference Index report for the African region. And we have very interesting findings that we have come out with, and we hope you will appreciate these findings and we can find solutions to the way forward in the region. Yeah. Could I have the next slide, please? Yes, so just to start with, I'm sure you are all into the area of tobacco control, and you really know a lot about some of the initial aspects of tobacco control in terms of the Framework Convention of Tobacco Control. And of course, we all know that tobacco causes a significant number of deaths. Currently, the figures we have shows around 8 million deaths. And as we know that tobacco causes both deaths among people who are exposed and to smokers and non-smokers as well. So even when you don't smoke, you're still at risk of getting some form of tobacco harm related from secondhand smoke exposure and even third-hand. And interestingly, this year, May 2023, marked the 20th anniversary of the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And I think we've made significant progress when it comes to tobacco control. And currently we have over 183 countries that have signed onto it. And with the latest signatory being Malawi, which really belongs to our region. And the interesting aspect is that we do have in the African region quite a low prevalence of smoking, and which is on the positive side if we can look at it like that. But we do have some countries like South Africa and Mauritius in the range of 17 to 16%, but most of them are within the range of 5 to 10%. And despite this low prevalence, we also know that tobacco use is actually reducing in some of the high-income countries. So, for example, the European region and the Americas. But the tobacco industry is really infiltrating some of our parts of the world, which includes a lot of these countries within low and middle-income countries, of which a lot of them belonging to Africa are also not spared of it. So we have the industries really getting their product into our domain as well. But despite all that, we've made a lot of progress when it comes to some achievements in tobacco control. For instance, in 2023, Mauritius was the first country that introduced plain tobacco packaging. This was in addition to countries like Netherlands, Brazil, and Turkey. These are very few countries which have really implemented plain packaging, and Mauritius was one of them. Botswana also has made good progress in terms of getting a Tobacco Control Act in 2021, which has a strong component of Article 5.3. despite a lot of tobacco industry interference. And like I said earlier, that the region is also experiencing some of the high rate of increase in the numbers of tobacco users. And this is mostly coming from the population growth and improving income of people. And then, of course, new products such as electronic cigarettes and both nicotine and non-nicotine derivatives that are actually being introduced into the region. And we also have issues with tobacco farming. So a lot of countries depend on tobacco cultivation and tobacco farming for their livelihoods. Although a lot of work has been done that shows that these are not very important to maintain the economy. I mean, these countries could still do well without them, even if tobacco cultivation and farming was not part of their livelihoods. So Zimbabwe, for instance, has almost about 25% of its total output coming from tobacco. Zambia follows with about 16% and Mozambique about 12.9%. So we have several of these countries which have put tobacco farming as one of their key economic growth factors. And next slide, please. And we can see from the latest report from the Global Tobacco Epidemic Report of 2023 that shows that when it comes to implementation of the Empower strategies, which is like the real tobacco control strategy that puts into place several cost-effective tobacco control measures when it comes to monitoring tobacco use, protecting people from smoke exposure, or offering cessation support, warning messages on cigarettes, raising taxes, enforcing bans on advertising. We've come out quite significantly, even in the region as well. And today, as of today, we have almost about 151 countries out of 195 countries that have actually been protected by at least one Empower measure, which is really quite a good progress as compared to just about 44 in 2007. So despite all the issues around tobacco control and the challenges we're having globally, there's been quite significant progress when it comes to tobacco control as well. So all is not lost yet. And next slide, please. And how does the tobacco industry get into some of the markets that we have, trying to get its presence in low and middle income countries? There are several ways, and the most common ways that were identified, especially in this report, was the industry trying to build alliances with groups in countries, trying to weaken certain policies in the countries when it comes to tobacco control, or disrupting or suppressing health information. And we've seen that especially when it comes to these electronic cigarettes, where tobacco companies have their own ideas in terms of their own research findings, where they come out with the non-harmful effects of these products. They also go about getting into lobbying and influencing policy making, disseminating findings that are actually not true, and some sort of confusion around tobacco smuggling and undermining tobacco control. So all this are some of the ways that they try and influence policy. Next slide, please. So the report for the tobacco industry interference report is actually the way that countries are implementing Article 5.3, which is part of the WHO FCTC guidelines, and how these countries meet their legal obligations to this article. And they're based both on scientific evidence and the actual country's experiences for that year. And the regional report, the first edition that came out in 2021, is a civil society report, actually, that is based on countries' experiences on the interference. And it's based on 7 main indicators that has to do with industry participation in policy development, corporate social responsibility activities by these industries, the benefits that the tobacco industries get from their presence in the country, and unnecessary interactions within industry, between industry and the government. Then the lack of transparency between what's happening between the industry and the government is also one of the indicators. And conflict of interest, where we have lots of industry officials on government boards, or government boards within industry boards or committees. Then preventive measures is the last indicator, where we look at how these countries are able to protect themselves from these industries' effect. Next slide, please. So in 2023, the scores look like what we have on the screen. And as you can see, that we can see interference in almost all the countries that we looked at the reports of. These were 18 countries that presented their reports for this year. And Cameroon was scoring the highest. So the higher the score, the more industry interference that the country faces, followed by Tanzania at 79 and Zambia at 77. So these were like the 3 top countries with the highest scores. But we also had countries like Botswana, Ethiopia, and Uganda, which really had lower scores. So it tells you that some countries are the extremes of interference, for instance, Cameroon topping the list. And then we have countries like Botswana also being at the lower down of interference. Next slide, please. And we've worked on the reports from 2019 to 2023, and there's a lot of interesting findings in terms of the fact that what we see over the years is quite consistent. Some countries have consistently been topping the list. So when it comes to Zambia, South Africa is actually doing a little better than it was in 2019, where we have seen the scores going down. But Zambia, Tanzania are some of the countries that really have been continuously over the board when it comes to the scores. Cameroon was recently added in 2023, and it has the highest score when it comes to interference scores. Countries like Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, and Botswana have been quite consistently low, and they've tried to come down with significant improvement over the years. So I think we should commend these countries for their significant findings in terms of tobacco control. So this really shows what's happening over the years, and as we can see, countries like Zambia and Tanzania are some of the top countries that have been having consistently high scores over the years. Next slide, please. And looking at the first indicator, which has to do with the industry participation in policy development and how the industry really influences policy within countries, Cameroon was topping the list, and it could be also one of the reasons why Cameroon tops the overall list of the scoring of the index for this year. And then Tanzania follows by 16 points and Zambia at 14 points. But we have countries like Madagascar, Mauritius, Kenya, and Gabon with very little industry participation when it comes to policy development in the country. Next slide, please. And if we look at what happens over the years, for instance, in this reporting period in Cameroon, some of the striking things that really came out in the report was that there was the British American Tobacco that was initiating and financing the standardization work of 2 new tobacco products, nicotine products. And this really shows the participation of the industry when it comes to even putting up tobacco control by the government. There's also participation by the industry in the development of standards when it comes to tobacco and tobacco products. And these standards are likely to become regulations. So that shows us why Cameroon might be one of the countries that really tops the list when it comes to interference in policy development. Mozambique, for instance, there is really no tobacco control legislation that complies with the WHO FCTC. And the tobacco industry is continuously consulted by the government when it comes to legislation involving the industry. Next slide, please. And the other indicator is the corporate social responsibility. And we all know from the time of COVID-19 that we saw this quite obviously in the times when a lot of countries were going through a lot of health burden related to COVID-19, and a lot of support was needed by health facilities and even as a country as a whole. And we saw the industries really coming out. So that was a time that we saw that the corporate responsibility of the industry really was out in the show, and they didn't lose that opportunity to do that. So we had countries like Zambia and Uganda and Tanzania and many others actually topping the list. But interestingly, we had countries like Botswana, Cote d'Ivoire, Mauritius, and Chad not reporting any corporate social responsibility within this reporting period. That was quite impressive. But we can see that almost all the other 14 countries, starting from Kenya all the way to Zambia, have been under the influence of corporate social responsibility by the industry. And the industry really takes advantage of these when it comes to making their mark. Next slide, please. And if we look at some of the actual things when it comes to corporate social responsibilities, we can see that some of the government agencies actually form partnerships with these industries. So in May 2021, in Nigeria, the BAT Nigeria was the Lagos State Commissioner for Agriculture commended BAT Nigeria, and then actually described the relationship between the state and the foundation as a very fruitful one. So this really shows a typical scenario where we can see a lot of corporate social responsibility developing between these two entities. And despite a lot of endorsement from the government and activities that are really banning all these things, we still have covert activities by the industry that are very obvious in some countries like Ghana, for instance, the Atlas Network, which has some affiliation with the industry, sponsors programs in Ghana, such as the Youth Opportunity Summit, which also has some industry links within the country. Next slide, please. And in Madagascar, for instance, there were several cases of the CSR activities when it comes to the industry and the government. Quite an obvious one was that the Ministry of Public Health and Imperial Brands relationship, where there was this support for health projects, almost about 63,000 USD was given out to fight against the spread of COVID-19 in 2020. And this has been happening in over the years, and the Malagasy state in Madagascar actually is quite vulnerable to the industry's social activities and their financial support. So this was one country that really showcased a lot of CSR activities when it comes to tobacco industry and the contributions made by them. Next slide, please. And the next indicator is with the benefits to the tobacco industry. So there are a lot of things that the government does that indirectly or directly benefits the industry. Some of them have to do with delaying the passage of taxes on these products, or increasing taxes, or they have longer time when it comes to implementing health warnings on cigarettes, or in the terms of introducing novel products and putting up very little regulations on these. And these were quite obvious in some countries such as Tanzania, where tobacco taxes have remained the same for the past 3 years running. And the government also supports the tobacco industry in terms of giving subsidies when it comes to production and inviting more companies to purchase the crop, where we have a lot of tobacco farming as well. Then in South Africa, there's been almost a 10-year delay when it comes to ratifying the protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products, which is a very important protocol when it comes to halting the illicit tobacco trade that happens in many countries, including South Africa. Then we have Gabon, which has passed the law to pass pictorial health warnings, but they've actually not been applied even till date. So these are some examples how the tobacco industry is able to benefit from the government delaying several of these tobacco control measures in these countries. Next slide, please. And in terms of the benefits, we have Cameroon topping the list as well, where they scored almost about 10 points. And several other countries were also high, like Mozambique, Madagascar, Zambia, Tanzania. So I think when it comes to benefiting the industry, we have almost all the countries doing something directly or indirectly that benefits the tobacco industry. But we still have Botswana and Ethiopia way down the list in terms of the tobacco industry getting a lot of benefits from some of the tobacco control measures. Next slide, please. But despite all this, we still have a positive side of the story where we've seen tobacco taxes increasing in many parts of the region. So, for instance, Ghana passed the Excise Duty Amendment Act this year on March 31st. And this was actually to replace the less effective excise taxes on tobacco products and introduce a hybrid structure. Mauritius also in their budget of 2023-24 announced an increment of excise duty taxes on tobacco by 10%. Similarly, in Nigeria, we had excise taxes on tobacco increase from 30% to 50% ad valorem. That was also effective mid-2023. In South Africa as well, they have introduced taxes on e-liquids, as well as increased taxes by 4.9% excise duties on cigarettes, which has actually been quite on the positive side of tobacco control, because we all know that tobacco taxes are one of the most cost-effective measures when it comes to tobacco control. Next slide, please. And there's also unnecessary interactions with the industry and the government. So there are certain interactions that the industry and the government have that really should not be present, but they do happen in many countries. And some of these interactions could be in the form of accepting assistance from the tobacco companies, or opportunistic social events and gatherings where you have tobacco industries coming to these events, or you have government officials attending some of these tobacco industry events. Then we have the formation of some sort of non-binding agreements, or developing even personal ties between government and industry officials. And within this period, we saw that Botswana, Gabon, and Ethiopia and Mauritius, on the good side, did not report any interactions in this reporting period. But we had countries like Madagascar and South Africa and Tanzania, which had the highest scores when it comes to these unnecessary interactions in some of these forms that I mentioned. Next slide, please. And so we can clearly see that there's really no unnecessary interactions in countries like Botswana and Ethiopia, Gabon and Mauritius, but we see them quite high, Madagascar and South Africa and Tanzania, and most all the other countries also have some sort of unnecessary interactions with the industry and the government that really goes all in the benefit of the industry. Next slide, please. And in Tanzania, for instance, some of these unnecessary interactions were quite obvious. And the picture that you can see there is actually the Italian ambassador to Tanzania and the retired ambassador, which was at an event in a five-star hotel in Dar es Salaam, where there was this launch of a luxurious cigar lounge. So this really shows sort of an image of what really happens within some of these countries, where we can see quite close personal ties between government officials and the industry, and their presence in many of these events within the country. Next slide, please. And in some countries, there were also reports of the industry actually receiving awards. And Nigeria, for instance, had this event where it gave the BAT Nigeria won the award for the best food, beverage, and tobacco category award within that sector of awards that were provided. And in Zambia, for instance, Japan Tobacco International was actually given the award of the Employer Award of the Year and this was actually for the second time in the country. Kenya as well, we saw the BAT Kenya that got almost about 6 awards at one of the Energy Management Awards in 2023. So the industry also benefits and is quite recognized in terms of even receiving awards in some of these countries. Next slide, please. And one of the ways that the industry also gets its presence felt in terms of supporting them and giving unnecessary interactions when it comes to policy and tobacco control measures is trying to assist the government for their own benefits when it comes to the fight against illicit tobacco trade. And this was observed in several countries like South Africa, Cameroon, Mozambique, and Uganda. In Uganda, for instance, the Uganda Revenue Authority actually accepted a cigarette destruction machine from BAT in an attempt to fight illicit tobacco trade. In Mozambique, for instance, the industry collaborated with government to actually fight anti-smuggling strategy. So these are all ways and strategies that the industry uses to get their presence felt and to show that they're actually supporting the government to fight tobacco use and the effects of tobacco use, but actually it's all in their benefit. Next slide, please. And the next indicator is to do with transparency and how transparent these government is when it comes to their interactions in terms of reporting meeting minutes, or their interactions when it comes to meeting reports or getting certain evidence of their meetings with industry or any form of interactions. How transparent are these countries? Actually, the interesting thing is none of the countries really showed complete transparency when it comes to the interaction between the government and the industry. And we have several of them actually topping the list, where we have Mozambique, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, and Zambia, and Mauritius actually topping the list. But we still have the other countries like Botswana and Ethiopia still below the other countries, but there's still not much when it comes to transparency. I think almost all the countries were victims of getting their information or whatever that interaction they had out into the public domain. There seems to be a problem there. Next slide, please. And like I said, the worst performing countries for this reporting period was Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Mauritius, and Zambia and Mozambique. In Zambia, for instance, the government does not disclose meetings and interactions with the industry. And in Cameroon, for instance, in 2021, the authorities in charge of health had a meeting that was not really reported and brought out in the public domain. But on the good side of it, Botswana, in their Tobacco Control Act that was recently passed, requires that the meetings between tobacco companies and government officials are to be held in public, and everything is supposed to be brought out into the public domain. Next slide, please. And when it comes to conflict of interest, in terms of protecting public health policy, we can see that almost all the countries are affected, and there is actually conflict of interest that occurs between the industry and the government in almost all the countries, including Botswana, Ethiopia, and Uganda, which were really low, down below. But we have countries like Gabon and Chad showing that they top the list here, and Madagascar, Cameroon also quite significantly high when it comes to conflict of interest. Next slide, please. And in terms of conflict of interest, that arises when we have institutions having vested interest to create concerns about the objectivity of the actions or judgment or decision making. And we have the revolving door phenomenon where we have people within the industry being present in committees or boards by the government, or vice versa, where we have government officials actually having significant roles in industry boards or committees or forums. And we have these countries like Gabon, Chad, Kenya, and Cameroon, which really top the list when we talk about conflict of interest between the government and the industry. Uganda and Ethiopia did not record any conflict of interest of any senior government official that joined tobacco industry, or the tobacco industry official joining any government board or within that reporting period. And we have also some of these industries that provide like some sort of monetary support in anticipation of maybe some political leverage or elections or upcoming programs. And that was quite obvious in Chad and South Africa, where we did see some of these industries providing that monetary support for political elections and all that. And next slide, please. And how do governments protect themselves when it comes to industries, and how what kind of measures do these governments take to protect their tobacco control policies from being undermined by the vested interest of the industry? Countries like Ethiopia, Uganda, Botswana, and Chad have been successful in having preventive measures when it comes to placing some sort of preventive measures to guide officials in their interactions with the industry. And we also saw code of conduct for public officials that describes some sort of standards when it comes to dealing with the industry. And this was seen in Chad, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. Countries like Ghana, Uganda, Botswana, and Nigeria actually compels the industry to periodically submit any information when it comes to production, manufacture, market share, or marketing expenditures, or any other activity that they deal with. And one of the requirements in the preventive measures, according to the Article 5.3, is that there should be a policy that disallows the acceptance of any form of contributions or gifts from the tobacco industry. But we can see that it happens in almost all the countries. And currently it exists in about 8 of the 18 countries that we generated a report for. Next slide, please. And when it comes to the preventive measures, like I said, almost all the countries do not have some sort of full protection when it comes to protecting their policies or their laws and control measures from the industry. Zambia, Mozambique, and Madagascar top the list. And when it comes to Ethiopia, Chad, Uganda, and Botswana, they are actually below the scores as compared to the other countries. Next slide, please. And some of the ways that the industry influences these governments and the way the government is able to protect themselves is by their procedures in place for disclosing records of the interactions with the industry. And we can see that many of these countries that we have here do not have any procedures in place for disclosing these records. We have them in some countries like Botswana, Burkina Faso, and Ethiopia. And the presence of a code of conduct for public health officials is really also absent in many of these countries. We have Chad as one of them that has a code of conduct, including Nigeria. And where the industry is required to periodically submit reports of the activities is also absent in many countries. But we have countries like Cote d'Ivoire and Ethiopia having some sort of regulations in place. And the presence of a program to raise awareness when it comes to FCTC Article 5.3, we can see that almost all the countries do not have anything like that except Ethiopia. And many of these countries do not have any policy that disallows the acceptance of any form of gifts or contributions from the industry. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, if we look at the scores when it comes to the reports that we generated in 2021 with that of 2023, you can see that the red bars indicate deterioration. So we can see that these countries are not doing so well, and the green bars shows improvement by these countries, some of these countries, and three of the countries such as Burkina Faso, Botswana, and Ethiopia showed quite some improvement when it comes to their scores of 2021 and 2023. And Cote d'Ivoire and Zambia showed marginal improvement, but it's still quite significant. Kenya was one of the countries that showed the highest level of deterioration, and we saw the scores by increasing almost 9 points between 2021 and 2023, with other countries like Nigeria from increased by 7 points and Tanzania by 6 points. Next slide, please. So based on the findings from the reports, some of the recommendations that we came up with that we think have been actually been present in many of the country reports that we looked at indicate that we need to look at these socially responsible activities and completely denormalize them or even ban them completely, so that there's really nothing like that in these countries, because that's one way the industry really gets to benefit through its agenda. And then maintaining a strong stance when it comes to industry interference in any form. So when it comes to the introduction of electronic nicotine and non-nicotine derivatives, putting these regulations and having a strong stance by these countries is an important move that we need to think about. A lot of these countries we saw did not even have proper tobacco control laws or regulations as a national law. And of course, we need to think about fast-tracking these country-specific laws and get these regulations in line with the FCTC. Capacity building and awareness, both public and political, is an important move that would benefit when it comes to the interactions that we see between government officials and the industry. Knowledge generation and evidence generation in terms of knowledge transfer is also very important. So getting a lot of research done when it comes to some of these novel products, including electronic cigarettes, is an important way to really bring out evidence, as we've seen a lot of it being done in a lot of high-income countries, and we cannot really transfer all the findings to our setting. So it's better we generate local data that would support policy development within our countries. And when it comes to promoting economically viable alternative livelihood, so of course we have countries that depend on tobacco farming for their economic growth, but a lot of evidence also supports that these countries can still survive without having tobacco farming as one of their main farming options. As adopting a code of conduct like we see in the preventive measures seems to be a very useful strategy when it comes to tobacco control measures. And civil society, as we have seen, as ATCA is one of them, and we've seen the importance of having civil society on board, and encouraging and empowering civil society is an important tool when it comes to getting comprehensive tobacco control at a country and regional level. Next slide, please. I think I'm almost coming to the end of my presentation, and I'll just end by an interesting quote by Michael Bloomberg from the Bloomberg Foundation, as he mentioned that as tobacco industry finds new ways to push its deadly products, we must also push back harder than ever. And I can see that we are actually trying to do that by even getting a report done at this time of the year is also an important move when it comes to tobacco control. And as national and local governments continue to lead the fight in protecting their citizens against the industry. I thank you for the opportunity to present the findings of this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I should confess to you right away that hearing the great detail of your presentation brings both the big clap on the many progresses that we have made in the region regarding tobacco control, or the fight against, the great toxicities of tobacco and all that, especially on the legislative front. But at the same time, there's the heartbeat of asking, are we winning really? And gladly you echoed already in the start of your presentation that not all hope is lost. And I want to stand on the same and in bringing the next part of our interaction. For those of our friends who may have joined us only later, this is the launch of the 2023 Africa Tobacco Industry Interference Index. And we're running in 3 languages, Portuguese, French, and English. You will be able to select what language is best applicable for you. And after this entire meeting is done, you will be able to have access to all 3 content, rather the content in all 3 languages for your use. I want to also specially acknowledge our colleagues in the media who are joining us from different countries, journalists, reporters, but also officials from government departments and different experts and advocates in the space of tobacco control. Let me open our interaction to the next section, which is a panel discussion picking on some feedback around the just shared index, and shared meaning not only the presentation here, but the entire product of the index. We have Cameroon, Botswana, and Senegal coming up to share some feedback on those directions. Remember, in these conversations, we build learning and guidance in how we can further foster some positive change in different regions, as different players from different angles within country and beyond. So when we hear the challenges from a particular country or region or section, also the success stories, they both equip our journey towards enabling the betterment of our global society. Henceforth, thanks again, Hussein. Let me quickly invite the next 3, but I will begin firstly by introducing one of the 3 people who are sharing feedback from the panel discussion. And after I do that, they will give a presentation. I will invite the next and give a little bit of an intro again for them until the 3rd person, so that we have a perspective of the 3 individuals who are speaking with us in this series of the discussion. Let me begin with Judith Chekumo. Judith Chekumo is a lawyer and a political scientist by training. She has been involved in tobacco control since 2012. That's about 11 years. And she's done this through the Cameroonian Coalition Against Tobacco, abbreviated as C3T, a group of Cameroonian civil society organizations working in tobacco control. As Executive Secretary of C3T, he has been responsible for administration and finance, and also accompanied major projects implemented by C3T with the support of its partners. Great welcome, Mr. Chekumo, and glad to have you in the interaction here on the Index launch webinar. And to start off, just wanting to learn from your side in terms of Cameroon and its score on this particular state of the index. Cameroon's highest score shows that it faces strong tobacco industry interference. What would you say explains this situation? And maybe you would also give some examples of certain scenarios from Cameroon in terms of the tobacco industry's interference in your country. Over to you.
Merci, Monsieur Master, de me passer la parole. À la lumière du rapport que nous avions élaboré ici au Cameroun, notre pays a enregistré un rapport de 81 sur 100, ce qui souligne l'intensité des manœuvres de l'industrie, comme vous l'aviez observé dans la précédente présentation. Nous dirons d'entrée de jeu que cette situation se justifie par l'absence de la loi nationale anti-tabac dans notre pays et évidemment d'une réglementation interdisant l'interférence de l'industrie du tabac dans l'élaboration et la mise en œuvre des politiques de contrôle du tabac. À titre de rappel, notre avant-projet de loi avait été initié en 2011 par le ministre de la Santé publique et relu en 2012 par la société civile à travers la coalition camerounaise contre le tabac pour vérifier la conformité de ces dispositions à la Convention cadre de l'OMS pour la lutte anti-tabac. Mais après relecture et réunion au sujet de cette loi au Premier ministère, ce texte a été transmis à la présidence de la République et elle attend son adoption jusqu'à ce jour. Nous notons également que cette ingérence de l'industrie du tabac avec ce score élevé est due à l'ignorance de la plupart des fonctionnaires impliqués dans le contrôle du tabac, des dispositions de l'article 5.3 de la CECLAT et de ses directives. Nous avons également assisté à plusieurs manœuvres d'ingérence de l'industrie du tabac dans notre pays, où on peut attribuer déjà préalablement cet avant-projet de loi qui stagne depuis 2012 et dernièrement la réglementation sur le marquage sanitaire graphique. Vous savez, au Cameroun, nous avons eu l'arrêté conjoint sur les avertissements sanitaires graphiques depuis le 3 janvier 2018. Et à partir de cette date, l'industrie du tabac avait besoin avait une durée d'un an pour se conformer à cette réglementation. C'est là où les manœuvres ont repris de plus belle. L'industrie a d'abord demandé l'annulation de ce texte au motif qu'il était contraire aux dispositions de la Convention cadre de l'OMS pour la lutte anti-tabac. Face au refus du gouvernement à travers une réunion qui avait été organisée au Premier ministère à ce sujet, l'industrie a par la suite initié les travaux de normalisation sur les conditionnements des cigarettes avec marquage en paquet de 10, puisque notre réglementation sur le marquage interdit le conditionnement des cigarettes en paquet de moins de 20 bâtons. Après ces travaux de normalisation à la dernière stade, on a opposé un refus à l'industrie au motif qu'il y avait déjà un texte réglementaire qui régulait les avertissements sanitaires graphiques. Par la suite, l'industrie a demandé des délais à n'en point fini pour s'arrimer à cette réglementation sur le marquage. Au début, comme je vous l'ai dit, l'industrie avait 12 mois pour se conformer. Passé ces 12 mois, l'industrie a demandé un délai de 6 mois, prétextant informer les chaînes de revendeurs sur l'entrée en vigueur du nouveau marquage sanitaire, lesquels 6 mois lui ont été accordés. Après l'entrée en vigueur de la première série d'images qui devrait normalement faire 24 mois. À la fin des 24 mois, l'industrie a demandé un autre délai supplémentaire pour l'entrée en vigueur de la seconde série d'images. Et le premier délai qui lui a été octroyé, là, était je peux dire en privé, puisque c'est lors du suivi de la mise en œuvre de cette réglementation que nous nous sommes rendus compte que le gouvernement lui avait octroyé un délai de 6 mois. Ce qui fait que la deuxième série d'images qui devait entrer en vigueur à partir de juin 2021 est entrée en vigueur en décembre. Quand je parle d'entrée en vigueur, c'est un abus de langage, puisque au terme de ces 6 mois, l'industrie a également demandé un autre délai supplémentaire de 3 mois et en plus un autre de 3 mois qui a ramené l'octroi des délais pour la seconde série d'images à 12 mois. Et les motifs étaient la pandémie du coronavirus, l'écoulement des stocks, des anciens stocks des produits du tabac. Donc, tous ces rallonges de délais ont finalement paralysé le cycle de mise en œuvre de la réglementation sur le marquage. La troisième série d'images attendues, qui devrait entrer en vigueur à partir du juin dernier, donc à savoir le 12 juin 2023, n'est pas encore effectif. L'avant-projet de décision qui doit être adopté par le ministre, qui fixe les images qui doivent figurer sur les paquets après chaque 24 mois. Ce projet de texte a été élaboré, transmis au ministère, mais jusqu'à date, la décision n'est pas encore sortie. Donc, nous, c'est là où on se retrouve actuellement au niveau de la mise en œuvre du marquage sanitaire. Donc, il y en a plusieurs autres exemples de la sorte d'ingérence de l'industrie du tabac où ils initient des travaux de normes sur les nouveaux produits à base de nicotine. Ils ont initié une réglementation sur la publicité. Donc, il y a plein d'autres exemples. Ce que nous pouvons retenir, c'est dans notre pays, pour la mise en œuvre effective et efficace d'une législation complète en matière de contrôle du tabac, il faut chaque fois et de manière permanente dénoncer et identifier, dénoncer et contrer les manœuvres de l'industrie pour leur freiner dans leur élan d'empiètement dans la mise en œuvre des politiques de contrôle du tabac. Nous avons également besoin du soutien pour élaborer une réglementation interdisant l'ingérence de l'industrie du tabac dans l'élaboration, la mise en œuvre des politiques de contrôle du tabac conformément à l'article 5.3 et ses directives. Nous aurons également besoin de la relecture de notre avant-projet de loi, puisque pratiquement 10 ans plus tard, ce projet de loi n'est plus à jour. Nous aurons besoin de la relecture et de la relance du processus d'adoption de ce projet de loi nationale anti-tabac. Je vous remercie pour votre aimable attention et l'opportunité que vous m'avez offerte pour partager l'expérience du Cameroun sur ce panel. Merci.
Thank you very much, Judith, for sharing the feedback there regarding Cameroon. And for those of our friends who may want to pose questions, feel free to get to our Q&A section at the bottom there of the platform and simply add your question, and the panelists in due course will be able to share feedback. Let me already invite the next panelist for this section of our webinar, and that is Jibril Mele. Jibril holds a master's degree in organizational management and auditing. He's a founding member and executive secretary of the Senegalese League Against Tobacco, established in the year 2011. With 22 years of experience in tobacco control in Senegal and Africa, he is the current national executive secretary of the organization, abbreviated as LISTAB, a member of TCA's board of directors responsible for coordinating activities in West Africa. And thank you so very much, Jibril, for being part of our interactions this day on the launch of the 2023 Tobacco Industry Interference Index. And maybe to just kickstart the conversation on your part, let me just share this question regarding the chief or main problems that you think the Senegalese government faces in preventing tobacco industry interference in terms of the tobacco control policies. What are the main problems that the government of Senegal faces in preventing the tobacco industry interference in tobacco control policies? And maybe you could also add what measures have been taken to curb or mitigate this interference. And maybe you can also add finally what role CSOs or civil society organizations, or is it NGOs, add or play in this space on this conversation. Let me leave it to you now.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour tout le monde. Je voudrais remercier tout le monde donc d'être là. Vous remercier de l'initiative par rapport au lancement donc de ce rapport. Par rapport à la question, je pense que au niveau du Sénégal, on observe quand même quelques problèmes. Déjà, le premier problème qui concerne un peu l'accès à l'information. Donc, c'est un problème d'information déjà, parce qu'il y a une difficulté donc de compréhension de l'ingérence de l'industrie du tabac, même si ça a été pris en compte donc dans notre loi de 2014. Donc ça, c'est un problème d'information parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'agents de l'administration quand même qui ne comprennent pas un peu quand même ce que c'est donc l'ingérence de l'industrie du tabac dans les politiques de santé publique. Ça, c'est un. Maintenant, deuxièmement, c'est une absence aussi de volonté politique, il faut le dire, parce que ça a été pris en compte dans la loi de 2014 en son article 1er. Malheureusement, depuis lors, il n'y a pas eu quand même d'action donc pour mettre en œuvre afin donc de diminuer un peu l'ingérence de l'industrie du tabac, comme nous le constatons régulièrement donc dans notre pays. Donc c'est par rapport donc à la première question, je pense que pour résumer, c'est un problème d'information par rapport à l'ingérence. Deuxièmement, c'est une volonté politique. Quand je dis volonté politique, ça veut dire que on n'a pas encore mis en œuvre l'article 1 donc de la loi anti-tabac donc depuis 2014. Maintenant, par rapport aux mesures, c'est vrai que il y a eu plusieurs mesures qui ont été prises en compte, à savoir comment dirais-je, prendre en compte, mettre en œuvre donc l'article 1er à travers un code de bonne conduite qui a été donc élaboré par le programme national de lutte contre le tabac en partenariat avec la société civile en vue vraiment d'aller vers la mise en œuvre donc de cet article 1er. Parce qu'il est important donc d'aller dans ça pour que vraiment les membres du gouvernement puissent vraiment non seulement comprendre, mais également signer au moins un papier qui, en tout cas, pourrait demain les protéger de toute ingérence de l'industrie du tabac, visant donc à saper un peu donc la réglementation. Donc ça c'est un. Deuxièmement, également, c'est vraiment le rôle un peu de la société civile. Bon, avant de venir sur le rôle de la société civile, c'est qu'il y a également un problème de coopération parce que depuis quand même ces derniers temps, il est à noter que il y a beaucoup de membres donc du gouvernement qui ne coopèrent pas. Donc, et cela rend un peu difficile donc le travail donc de ce que nous faisons donc sur le terrain. Notre rôle a toujours été de sensibiliser, de mener le plaidoyer afin que l'ingérence donc de l'industrie du tabac soit quand même considérée comme une priorité pour nos gouvernements. Par la mise en place d'une équipe de surveillance appelée l'équipe de surveillance du Sénégal, qui est composée donc d'experts du gouvernement et également des personnes ressources venant de la société civile qui travaillent un peu afin de produire régulièrement donc des rapports après avoir enquêté. Donc ces rapports sont partagés avec les membres du gouvernement à travers la presse, les médias donc d'une manière générale. Donc c'est toujours vraiment ce travail que nous continuons donc à faire pour ensemble qu'on puisse vraiment arriver à réduire ou en tout cas arrêter carrément donc cette ingérence au niveau donc du Sénégal. C'est vrai qu'il y a eu quand même beaucoup d'évolutions entre-temps. Depuis que le rapport du Sénégal a été produit, donc il y a eu quand même des évolutions et je sais que le prochain rapport de 2024 donc va permettre donc de faire évoluer donc le classement pour le Sénégal parce que il y a eu quand même des avancées. Il faut le dire, un arrêté a été pris en compte, a été donc pris en charge par le ministère des Finances pour mettre en place comment dirais-je, un système de suivi et de traçabilité des produits du tabac au Sénégal. Donc, c'est l'information qui nous a été partagée récemment. Je pense que ça va beaucoup aider sur le commerce illicite donc, des produits du tabac. L'autre chose également, c'est par rapport aux nouveaux produits du tabac émergents. Hein, la bonne nouvelle, c'est que dans la loi rectificative donc, des finances de 2024, également l'information que nous avons reçue à travers donc la présentation du rapport, c'est que les nouveaux produits tabac émergents qui n'avaient pas été pris en compte dans la loi de 2014 vont être taxés au même titre que le tabac à hauteur de 65%. Et cela également va dissuader, va en tout cas dissuader donc les vendeurs, également les exportateurs. Donc ça, je pense que c'est des bonnes nouvelles. Hein, et ça pourrait également permettre de lutter un peu contre l'ingérence de l'industrie du tabac. Donc vraiment, c'est un peu ce que je voulais dire, contribuer par rapport donc à votre question, par rapport également au lancement donc de ce rapport. Je vous remercie encore une fois de votre aimable attention.
Thank you, Jibril. That's a very interesting feedback there, but also acknowledging the great news, as I mentioned earlier to Dr. Sin, that sometimes some elements of our interaction get to exhibit some negative points of our situation. And all the time we see that there are positive strides being made. Congratulations over the novel products, and that they will equally face some taxation at 55%, I guess, coming through to 2024. We would hope that even these pieces of legislation would advance further in many of our regions. That's why this interaction is important, to just inspire more action through different examples from different sections. And talking about examples, I wish to already switch to our last panelist in this section of feedback from 3 countries drawn from different sections of our continent. And this is from another area of success. Now, we'll be speaking with Professor Buntle Mbongwe. Buntle Mbongwe, the head of School of Public Health and founding head of the Department of Environmental Health in the Faculty of Health Sciences. That's in the University of Botswana. He holds a PhD in Environmental Health from the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and a Master of Science degree in Biology from the University of Ottawa in Canada. She has conducted research on diverse issues related to pesticides and toxic heavy metal exposures, tobacco and health, healthcare waste, management, HIV, non-communicable diseases as NCDs, and poisoning. Professor Mbongwe is a recipient of 2 WHO Director General Awards on Leadership in Global Tobacco Control, awarded in 2003 and 2021. She is the founder and executive director of the Anti-Tobacco Network. We are presented in this last part of the interaction, dear friends and ladies and gentlemen, with an interesting success story coming all the way from Botswana. And Prof comes in to share some very important elements. Prof, thank you once again for being part of our interaction in this INRIX launch webinar. And already we see that Botswana is revealed to be performing the best in the entire continent of Africa when it comes to protecting public policies from tobacco industry interference. The country scored just about 2 years ago in 2021, a mark of 50, and now 33, taking a very significant lead. Wanting to also know, while acknowledging the Tobacco Control Act of 2021, how has the Tobacco Control 2021 contributed to the significant improvement of rank from 50 to 33 as at now? And perhaps you can also add in terms of the best practices in Botswana that could help serve as examples for the rest of the other countries in the entire region? Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank ATCA for this great event. And secondly, let me thank Dr. Ati for the very comprehensive report that she gave and the encouragement that she gave us. For Botswana, we've come a long way. And many will know that this has been a fight for survival because the tobacco industry never allow us to go to sleep in Botswana. So the big change has come about, yes, because the government of Botswana, despite the challenges and in the amidst COVID-19, chose to fight for the tobacco control law, the new tobacco control law, which was passed in 2021. The beauty of this act is that it, amongst all others, as much as comprehensive as it is in terms of the WHO FCTC, it is a very comprehensive also in terms of Article 5.3, in terms of the interests of the protecting public interests in terms of the tobacco industry. This new act requires transparency on interactions of the tobacco industry by the country. Additionally, this new act prohibits any partnerships or agreements or contributions, including voluntary contributions, among others, from the tobacco industry. And to top it all, it goes further, and which I think we should acknowledge as much as we are talking about Article 5.3. It goes further to comprehensively address Article 13 of the FCTC, which is closely linked to the Article 5.3, and therefore it totally bans tobacco advertising, promotion, and sponsorship. And it bans a display on tobacco products and so forth. The most, what we can remember the most about the fight for this law, especially in the era of COVID-19, was when the tobacco industry challenged the Minister of Health in writing, and that in writing essentially trying to stop the passing of the new law. But then, and at the same time, as you would know, the tobacco industry was fighting very hard, and was also convincing other government or parliamentarians to feeding them with information that would discourage the government from passing the law. And what we have learned from this, what made us win, one was the fact that we had evidence. So tobacco control must be, or strategies or interventions must be supported by evidence, because the tobacco industry also does research. And so we cannot afford to sit behind and believe that we will only rely on saying tobacco kills more than 8 million people around the world. We need to do more than that and have research at our local level to be able to provide our policymakers with information that they can use, that people can relate with within our own settings. So there was evidence-based information, and we must thank our partners, ATCA and many others who supported us also in providing evidence and to actually carry out some research situation analysis and be able to scan the environment within Botswana. The other important thing is, as advocates, we must get closer to the government, and we must be friends of the government. As much as a lot of times you know that there's a lot of friction between government and civil society, but we have to work at those relationships. And I'll tell you that during this fight, what worked the most for us was the fact that we were sitting at the same table with the government as the government was debating this law in Parliament and helping each other for the good of the country. So, as at the end of it all, the public, because of the evidence that we all were sharing with the public in terms of the harms that are caused by tobacco, in terms of what the tobacco industry is doing to stop or to prevent public health from prevailing, the public then rallied behind us. And at the end of the day, then we all won. As much as we have won, it is not easy. As we speak, the government of Botswana is working on regulations in order to implement this law. It's another battle that we have to deal with, because as you will know, even coming up with regulations is not going to be an easy task, because the tobacco industry is still, trying very hard to win other political arms of government so that they can be able to win their own battle. And so we still need to come up together. And I agree with Dr. Ati that we need to continue to push back, and we need to continue also to look for capacity build, to have capacity building. Our government officials do need support, because at the end of the day, our tobacco control offices are not just focusing on tobacco. There are many other competing priorities for governments. And so at the end of the day, even the tobacco control offices do need to be strengthened in order for governments and the nations to win at the end of the day. So those for me were the lessons that we learned, and we continue to soldier on, and will rely also on the help of other international organizations. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Prof. Thank you so very, very much. It's great to receive different angles of lessons to inspire our journey. It reveals that when you talk about regulations, it really means, as we should all acknowledge, that the journey doesn't really end on Tuesday or Thursday, but the week is way longer. I think power is in knowing that there's a lot of positive strides and successes that we can harness, also spread around, such as we're doing in this interim. Dear friends and ladies and gentlemen, just a quick reminder, your questions to the Q&A. I see that there are different people sharing and others coming in, in different languages. That's more than invited and welcome. I will be able to address all the comments that are coming through in that space. Just now, I want already to link to our last panel discussion, and this is expert opinion source. I want to interact with two people who may give us some angles of greater depth of context and information as regards our topic of conversation. And I wish to already bring in, and so I'll introduce them one by one, and they speak, and the next, before trickling down to a space of interaction. And let me begin with Professor Olalekan Ayo Yusuf. He's a well-known leader in the tobacco control space in South Africa and the world over. He is the current chairperson and head of the School of Health Systems and Public Health at the University of Pretoria. He has been involved in tobacco control research for over 20 years and has led several longitudinal studies on tobacco use, particularly in South Africa. He's the director of the African Center for Tobacco Industry Monitoring and Policy Research at the National Council Against Smoking in South Africa. Prof, great welcome. It's lovely to have you in our interaction in the launch of the 2023 Tobacco Industry Interference Index. And as Prof gets set in a few seconds to just speak with us, let me already highlight our primary question in this introduction. As an expert in tobacco control in Africa and also executive director of the African Center for Tobacco Industry Monitoring and Policy Research, ATIM, what thoughts do you have on Dr. Artie's presentation on the thoughts made by the 18 parties to the WHO FCTC, and also what are your recommendations to the parties, the different countries in that space? Prof, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. And indeed, a significant milestone in tobacco control in the region. And Dr. Artie, congratulations again for being able to put together a very high quality report, which I hope would motivate member states, and particularly beyond even the countries that beyond the 18 countries, to take action as it relates to tobacco industry interference in policy process. So, I have a few comments. First is the fact that the report itself suggests that a significant number of countries deteriorated in scores as in relation to tobacco interference. Suggests preventing tobacco interference is not an event, but an ongoing process that must be mainstreamed with policy process, be it policy development, adoption, or implementation. And so there's never an end to it. So everybody needs to be conscious, and every country needs to be conscious that it is something that you have to keep doing. The second point that I see from the report, it is quite the positive, quite heartening to see that increases in excise tax in 2 countries and introduction of excise on e-liquid for e-cigarette, which has remained a concern in many countries. However, it is also important to note that most countries of all these empire measures have not really taken the tax, raising taxes to the level that is best practice as prescribed in the WHO FCTC guidelines. But knowing that Mauritius becoming the first African country to adopt the full-scale tobacco control measure shows that it is possible to do all of this in terms of empower and many more. And I'm very glad to see that at least we can show as a continent that we have the ability to move forward and fully implement the FCTC, because sometimes people say it's not possible to do this in the continent. So the lesson from that for me, or from all this findings, is that we must remain focused on tobacco, on implementation of the WHO FCTC as envisaging the SDG 3.8, including developing building capacity for research, policy research, and capacity of advocates to use evidence to drive research, because that becomes the basis, as Prof. Buntley said, to counter industry interference and industry arguments. And again, many of the evidence that has been drawn into this index comes from the ability to research and use them for the purpose of this report. Finally, given that the recent WHO epidemic, taking those results and looking at the WHO Global Epidemic Report, which suggests that most countries in the Afro region now have a daily smoking prevalence of 10% or lower. And I think it's important to say that despite the picture that we see in the TII, the global picture is that the Afro region has been improving to a very large extent in reducing tobacco use. Yes, the base of the population is much higher, and therefore the numbers of smokers may be higher. But currently, we do have most countries daily smoking below 10%, which, by the way, is what many countries in the global north are aspiring to be. And they are giving us all sort of other strategies that they are using. So, but this finding for me shows that we do not need the industry-driven and profit-motivated harm reduction. In fact, I'll call it harm normalization, because they want us to accept that you cannot live without nicotine or any other form of tobacco, but you must just accept that you will have less harm than cigarette. So we are not going to normalize harm in Africa, and we reject the harm reduction, harm normalization strategy, and we must remain focused on driving the implementation of the WHO FCTC into the full-scale measures of the FCTC. Thank you, and again, congratulate ARTCA and all the advocates, because this is for the advocates in the African region, and wish you all the best as we continue the struggle. Thank you.
Thanks so very much, Prof. I was busy jotting down some lines here and there and taking strong around the very points you are sharing, the idea of harm normalization or acceptance that it is as it should be, and therefore we should live with it. So very, very inspiring that, we should be able to take a serious position towards doing the good without compromise. Thank you so very much for sharing. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, we should now get the second speaker from the expert section or panelists of our discussion this time. And this is Dr. Mary Assunta. Mary Assunta is the head of Global Research and Advocacy at Global Center for Good Governance in Tobacco Control, globally well known as GGTC, and a partner in STOP, and principal author of the Global Tobacco Industry Interference Index. She is a Luther Terry Award 2003 recipient for outstanding leadership in tobacco control, representing low and middle income countries in many platforms to counter and debunk tobacco industry tactics. She has more than 20 years of experience in international tobacco control advocacy. Mary is the principal author of the Global Tobacco Industry Interference, as I referred to earlier, and she has a doctorate in public health from the University of Sydney School of Public Health. Doc, great welcome. It's good to see you, and good to have you in this very special interaction. I do know of your great passion in this space, and it's great to have you share time and some views in this interaction to all of us. And to Dr. Assunta, as the head of the global advocacy at GGTC, how do you evaluate the 2023 Africa Tobacco Industry Interference Index? What analysis do you make of the progress observed in certain countries? What can be said about the countries that are having difficulties in having their public health policies put into action? Those are my bountiful of questions I wish to drop on you. Over to you, Doc.
Thank you very much, Master Chimbala. May I begin by congratulating ATCA team and Dr. Arti for a great report. and also to acknowledge the hard work done by the 18 country collaborators in preparing their country reports, which then fed into the regional Africa report. The Africa Tobacco Industry Interference Index is really an important and valuable advocacy tool for Africa, and that is so because it is being taken seriously. Evidence is firepower. So the index clearly shows that only a handful of companies, and that's, Big Tobacco, BAT, Japan Tobacco, Imperial Tobacco particularly, are involved in the interference in public health across the countries. So the index has documented and exposed these companies' interference and how they undermine government efforts. But also the important point that the index represents is how governments have responded or not responded or collaborated with the industry in order to push its agenda rather than to protect public health. So while more countries deteriorated, as we heard from Dr. Arti, 8 countries versus those who improved, 3 countries. However, I want to point out that the countries that improved, Botswana, Burkina Faso, and Ethiopia, have actually done marginally better than the deteriorated. So this speaks well of their effort. It's reflected in the advancement in tobacco control in these countries. In other words, when you implement Article 5.3 seriously, when the government does that, tobacco control will move, will advance. And we saw evidence of that. In fact, we heard that several times mentioned today. And special congratulations to Botswana for their achievement in including Article 5.3 in their Tobacco Control Act. So tobacco control, the observation here, when I acknowledge what Botswana has achieved and also Burkina Faso and Ethiopia, I want to point out that tobacco control is not expensive. Implementing tobacco control is possible. Many countries, particularly in low-income countries, have actually done it. So it is not something that is beholden only to high-income countries. Actually, many low-income countries have adopted and implemented Article 5.3 in their legislation or in their code, and that has really contributed towards advancement in tobacco control. Among the countries that deteriorated, Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, I do want to point out that particularly in the case of for Kenya, elements of Article 5.3 exist in their legislation. So the problem here is that lack of implementation or a delay in the implementation of what is already in the legislation. So an important point here to remember is that the Ministry of Health is your ally. And so, you need to work closely with the Ministry of Health to provide support and technical assistance to them, as was indicated today by Dr. Bontley. Now, several countries that are languishing at the bottom, particularly Zambia, Tanzania, they seem to be moving in the opposite direction this past few years. So what we see is an increase in tobacco production and tobacco industry is encouraged, and hardly any movement or very slow movement in tobacco control legislation. And in the case of Zambia, we actually saw the adoption or the passing of Tobacco Act. And this is an act that actually promotes the tobacco industry and protects it. So therefore, while tobacco control is being left behind, the industry is actually being supported, and that really is moving in the opposite direction of what the WHO FCTC requires. We heard from Cameroon, and so they are a newcomer to the survey, but you heard that strong national legislation has actually been delayed since 2014. So take-home point here is that governments who ratified the FCTC and are parties to the FCTC, have had many years to actually implement the measures that they had committed to. So we need to now point the light on where the delay lies or where the interference is really taking place. Conflict of interest, unnecessary interaction between government officials and the industry remains a problem, and the lack of transparency. These 3 points you actually see across practically all of the countries that that was surveyed. And this is a point not just for Africa. We notice this also in other countries, in other parts of the world as well. So this seems to be a problem that really must be addressed, and we need to pay attention to how to plug the loopholes there. Areas where more effort is therefore needed, I'll just touch on a few. CSR remains the main way in which the tobacco industry puts a foot in the door. And we see this again across countries, even in those countries that have actually banned tobacco-related CSR, as in Uganda. The industry will find a way to actually break the law or sidestep the law and find a way to associate itself with the government. And what needs to be done is we need to denormalize, because that's what the Article 5.3 calls for, denormalizing tobacco industry related CSR activities and actually to ban them as required in Article 13. The non-health sector remains vulnerable, and this is the sector that the industry actually targets and forms allies with, or partnerships, or actually approaches. And we saw evidence of that being presented today. And we also therefore need to look at preventive measures, and this was clearly outlined in the report by Dr. Arti. But the code of conduct, I want to fish that out to say that it's an important measure that needs to be adopted. Africa needs to improve in good governance, and you need to hold your government accountable, because they agreed to implement Article 5.3, and good governance is actually the main element overriding the requirements of Article 5.3, and the measures mentioned in it are actually anti-corruption measures. So it's all about anti-corruption and good governance, really. So the framing of Article 5.3 therefore becomes really very important. So the code of conduct is actually a firewall that separates the government from the industry, and therefore officials get freed up to fulfill their mandate, which is to protect public health. So in conclusion, I want to say the tobacco industry wants Africa. As we heard from Professor Lekan just now, the smoking prevalence is low, average 10%, in some countries lower, and single digit, but the industry wants to change that. So the industry wants Africa. You need to implement Article 5.3 to protect Africa from the tobacco industry. And you are in a position to assist the government to accomplish that. Thank you very much. Over to you, Master Chimbala.
Thank you very much, Doc. Thank you for sharing all that and for remarking on the firewall aspect. Indeed, quite a serious stretches that have to be implemented in all our sections as we foster this important and fight. Right now, we've got into a section where we can check out some questions that have come through. I know several people have given various comments within the space Q&A within this Zoom platform. I've captured a few, and I know that I'll just read them out. And those that will need to be taken on as well can be taken on once, and the rest of the team also on standby to help where we need to some of those picked. So I'll just read all of them. I picked just a few just now. From Abubakar says, Sierra Leone becomes the 38th country with tobacco control laws in WHO African region. How do they fare compared to the 18 outlined countries with regards to the Tobacco Control Interference Index? I'll read the additional 3, but while doing so, just for all the panelists, please take note that you may need to take 1 or 2 of these here and there, depending on which one is applicable for you. Mwangi asks and says, what are the sources of the data relied on? And I know this question is always important because of our media colleagues, including people like me, for purposes of news and reference. But also, I know that later, the detailed document is yet to be shared in that regard, which will provide a lot more bone to the stake. So that's from Mwangi, sources of information. Viviana asks and says, hello, I'm Viviana Diata. I'm writing to you from Senegal. My concern is the terrain occupied by tobacco interference in our different countries. What should we do to concretely stop this? All right, and finally, the last one is from Nkurunzinza, who says, I would like to ask the first panelist the reason why Burundi is not ranked, presented, and its data, as it is a country where the industry interference and tobacco consumption is high. Is it the lack of data or what? I guess this goes to Dr. Arti. So please, any responses? Maybe we'll begin with Dr. Arti or anyone who may be available among the panelists to take up any of these questions shared so far, or any of those you may have read on your own in our questions section, questions and answer section of our interaction. Panelists?
Yes, I could just speak on the question related to why Burundi was not part of the report. I think it's based on the country-specific reports that these countries submitted, and I think Burundi was not part of those countries that submitted the interference report from their country. So I think that was why it was not included, and I think maybe Mr. Lyons would also have an answer to this. And in terms of the methodology and what data we use, most of these are from the reports that are generated by the countries and also from media and press releases. Yeah.
Noted. Thank you. Lyons, will you come in? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Arti and Master Chambala. I think, yes, for country selection, we really also focus on some analysis that we do with our country partners, civil society in each country. And those analyses will come from, how government is performing in implementing the Article 5.3, and also how we see the industry, interfering some of those industry tactics. So Burundi, not on the list, but we will be increasing in terms of numbers. So soon, maybe it will be in the list. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there's a plea or an outcry that I would equally share from our colleague from Senegal, who's talking about the concern that the tobacco industry interference in our different countries seems to be succeeding in a way from Viviana's perspective, and I think many of us would in a way see it as such. And the question is, what can we do concretely to stop this? And I don't know who can take up that question. Yeah.
It's like Mary wants to come in. If you want, Mary, please go ahead, and I can also jump in. Thank you.
Yeah. Governments as parties to the WHO FCTC actually know exactly what needs to be done, because the FCTC provides, article by article action points that need to be taken. So governments just need to implement the FCTC. But the purpose of the Article 5.3 is really important, because it's the overarching article that empowers and protects the government so that they can be freed up to implement the FCTC. So there seems to be interference, and particularly from the industry, to stop governments. So the industry can only win, as the question posed, if the government allows it to win. I think that's the whole point of the index. We can't say that the industry is stronger, because government is stronger, regulators are stronger, the treaty is stronger. So what needs to happen is, we heard our colleague from Senegal say this political will is needed in order to implement the FCTC. So the industry is only successful in interfering because it is allowed to be successful in interfering. So when you look at the examples of Botswana, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, what have they actually done, particularly in the case of Botswana and Burkina Faso? They have not recorded instances of CSR. They have not, in many areas of Article 5.3, they have actually not recorded because the government is serious. The government has exhibited political will to implement the FCTC and has got a strong Tobacco Control Act, in 2021. So that would be my response as to how to address industry interference. Thank you.
Merci, merci Mary. Master Chimbala, peut-être je vais compléter aussi à ce que Mary a dit pour dire que la société civile et les médias aussi ont un rôle à jouer. Et pour dire que si les médias peuvent continuer à parler de cette ingérence et la société civile continue à aborder cela avec les gouvernants vont beaucoup plus sentir leur engagement parce que c'est une responsabilité qu'ils ont en ratifiant la convention et c'est aussi une responsabilité qu'ils ont sur leur population de protéger les populations. Et donc, cette action de la société civile et des médias pourrait les amener à beaucoup plus s'engager dans la mise en œuvre de la convention et à éviter les ingérences de l'industrie tabac ou à protéger leur politique contre ces ingérences. Je voudrais dire pour la question de Sierra Leone, oui, Sierra Leone récemment a adopté une loi anti-tabac qui est une loi assez intéressante et assez forte aussi. Et l'ingérence de l'industrie du tabac, oui, est présente, même si le pays n'a pas fabricant de cigarettes ou d'autres produits du tabac, le tabac est importé. Mais nous savons qu'il y a d'ingérence et ce sont des pays que nous allons analyser de près, comme j'ai dit tout à l'heure pour le Burundi, pour les incorporer dans les prochaines listes. Donc, nous avons pris très bonne note de la préoccupation de Apollinaire et de Aboubakar. Merci.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the great job our colleagues are doing in making sure that all our friends on the platform getting the content in all the languages, including myself, depending on the content being shared there. Thank you so very much. And thanks to Leonce and Dr. Sunta for giving feedback to those questions. Remember to all our colleagues that the content being developed in this entire interaction, together with the report, available and shall be shared with every one of us. And for further reference and follow-up, that is a possibility of something that you can still do. I need to now get to closing around the final but key piece of our interaction, and that is around the very product we are referring to, and that is the invitation of ATCA Executive Secretary to give a presentation on the report to all of us. This will just be a short presentation to all of us. Mr. Leonce Sesu, over to you.
Merci, merci Master, merci beaucoup pour la modération et je voudrais dire un grand merci à nos invités sur la discussion de ce jour. Nous avons eu de très bonnes contributions et d'entrée de jeu, je voudrais remercier Dr. Ati Singh et son équipe pour le travail abattu et Mary Assunta pour l'accompagnement avec toute l'équipe de DGTC. Et je voudrais dire aussi un grand merci à professeur Lekan pour son apport et son appui et tous les partenaires dans les pays qui ont travaillé. Nous avons eu des partenaires de la société civile, nous avons eu des consultants qui ont été associés avec nous. Je voudrais par ici dire un grand merci à tous ceux qui ont contribué à la production des rapports des pays et à la production de ce rapport régional. Aussi, l'équipe de ATCA, je voudrais dire un grand merci à l'équipe qui a soutenu ce travail Je vous présente ici brièvement le contenu du rapport qui est disponible. Et c'est déjà disponible sur un lien qui sera partagé, mais le rapport aussi sera envoyé à tout le monde avec toutes les informations, et même l'enregistrement de ce jour sera aussi circulé. Donc, le contenu est présenté, c'est le rapport que vous voyez comme ça sur mon écran. Je vais juste parcourir en 1 minute brièvement et mettre le lien. Je vais afficher le lien tout à l'heure et mettre dans le chat que vous pourrez lire, mais déjà beaucoup d'informations, donc toutes les informations présentées et discutées sont dans ce document que je suis en train d'afficher. Alors, voilà le rapport en termes de documents qui seraient exploités et c'est la fin du document. Et je voudrais par cette occasion dire à nos partenaires pays et les 18 pays, et les partenaires pays qui sont dans les 18 pays, donc ils peuvent l'exploiter. Le classement est désormais disponible et le classement par chaque indicateur est aussi disponible et il reste à aller exploiter cela. Le rapport sera disponible en français, donc nous allons bientôt aussi partager le rapport en français. Comme vous voyez déjà, il est disponible en anglais. Et le lien pour l'obtenir, pour le lire, donc c'est aussi un lien qui est disponible. Je crois que vous pouvez donc aller le télécharger déjà à ce lien. Et le rapport est disponible à ce lien et vous pouvez tous l'obtenir. Je l'affiche encore ici. Pour ceux qui veulent faire une capture d'écran rapide, vous pouvez faire. Il y a un lien court qui est ici et un lien plus long, donc sur le site de ADCA. Et le rapport est disponible avec toutes les autres informations. La présentation de Dr. Ati est aussi disponible. Vous allez aussi avoir accès au rapport des pays et des contenus que le rapport présente. Et je vous remercie et je vais m'arrêter là et dire un grand merci à Master Chimbala pour avoir modéré cette discussion de ce jour et le lancement de ce document. Je vais aussi dire un grand merci à nos interprètes qui nous ont soutenus. Ils ont fait un grand travail dans les 3 langues. Et notre rapport couvre le Mozambique aussi, ce qui fait que nous avons le portugais qui a été aussi ajouté. Et je vais donc, avant de finir, avant qu'on ne termine, demander que nous fassions une photo de famille, une photo de groupe, je vais dire. Donc, Master Chimbala et Mary, et Dr. Assunta, et Dr. Ati, Judith, et je vous dis un grand merci et je vous prie d'ouvrir votre caméra et nous allons faire une photo de célébration de de ce lancement. Alors, Caleb Deodatus, vous nous assistez et vous nous dites quand est-ce que c'est bon. Dr. Ati, votre caméra. Si Dr. Ati est là, nous avons besoin de votre visage, Dr. Ati. OK. OK, let's go. Let's continue. Dr. Ati n'est pas peut-être à son poste. Alors, Caleb, faites la photo. Et dites-nous quand c'est prêt. Monsieur Wele, Djibril, votre caméra aussi.
C'est bon, c'est fait.
OK. D'accord, merci. Alors, merci à tous et à très bientôt, Monsieur Chimbala, Madame Judith, Monsieur Wele, Dr. Assunta
Merci.
et Dr. Ati. Merci à vous et à très bientôt. Et
Merci.
pour tous nos participants qui nous ont suivis, nous leur disons aussi un grand merci, ainsi que les hommes des médias, les professionnels des médias qui vont faire une couverture. Ils ont été nombreux sur la discussion aujourd'hui et ont intervenu. Nous vous disons un grand merci et nous allons continuer à circuler les informations à vous tous avec l'enregistrement et tous les documents. À très bientôt. Bye bye.
Bye, à bientôt.
Bye bye.